Hi, my name is Dr. Rashawn Ray, aiming to speak truth to power, and this is my daily thought. Racism still exists today. We still have 2 inches of a 6-inch knife in our backs, to use that analogy. And what some people think is that simply because 4 inches have been pulled out and progress has been made, that we still shouldn't have a problem with the 2 inches that are still in our backs, that we still shouldn't have a problem with the wound that the 4 inches left in our back, and that we still shouldn't have a problem with being in pain and hurting every single day. And that's what's happening today. In other words, racism, yes, existed in the past and we've made progress. But unfortunately, racism still exists today. And that's what Colin Kaepernick is talking about, right? I mean, it's interesting. People are like, Colin Kaepernick isn't necessarily making his point. What he's trying to do isn't working. I definitely think it's working. Everybody is talking about it. Everyone is talking about human rights, and everybody is talking about police brutality. And that is exactly what he wanted, right? And he's doing a lot of things behind the scenes, as a lot of athletes are. They rarely get played up. Everything they do bad gets played up. Nothing that they really do good gets played up, right? And he's in a similar situation in this particular context. One of the main problems is that people only see racism on a micro level. And they think, since I'm not engaging in racism, or at least overt forms of racism and prejudice and discrimination, it doesn't mean that it's not operating covertly. It doesn't mean that it's not happening implicitly in ways that people don't exactly know. People think that it's not going on. But see, this is the thing. There's so many examples on an institutional level, because see, racism operates on 3 main levels: micro level through face-to-face interaction, meso level through social context. I'll get to that later. Macro level through social institutions. Let me give you some examples of what's happening today in the 21st century as it relates to racism. First, the Department of Justice released some scathing reports about Ferguson and Baltimore that stated that police officers are engaging in egregious forms of racial discrimination, stopping black motorists for no reason, right? Profiling them, brutalizing them, and even killing them. And then we wonder why Ferguson and Baltimore are the 2 main centers of the Black Lives Matter movement as it relates to protest on the ground, even though these sorts of things are happening all across the country. And we see that, for example, in San Francisco, where Colin Kaepernick is, the police department, they're about to come up with a Department of Justice report on them too. They have had so many racial incidents of police officers making statements, of police officers doing things while they're on patrol. And we try to act like that this stuff isn't happening today, right? This stuff is systemic. This stuff is continuing to go along. The other thing, there's a study by sociologist Dr. Diva Pager, who's now at Harvard. She was at Princeton before. She did a study where she sent out essentially 4 groups of men. 2 groups that had a previous criminal record, 2 groups that did not, for petty crimes. Nothing that was violent, but, breaking and entering, or, doing something with the vehicle, something along those lines. What she found when she sent these individuals to thousands of places to try to get jobs is that not only did the whites without a criminal record get hired more and get more callbacks than blacks, but whites with a criminal record was more likely to get called back for a job than blacks without a criminal record. Yeah, you heard me correctly. Whites with a criminal record was more likely to be entertained for a job and end up potentially getting a job than a black person without a criminal record. That is race. That is how racial discrimination is playing out in our labor market. Labor market, that's how people get money. That's how people build wealth. That's how people take care of their families. That's how people end up getting homes. That's how people are able to retire early. We are talking about the lifeline of people's existence, right? That is racism. There was another study similarly that looked at names, the names that people are called, say Rashawn compared to Jim. And found that black sounding names, Latino sounding names, were less likely to get called back for a job. One of the classic stories is a man whose name is Jose. He simply removed the S from his first name and didn't change his resume or anything like that. I should have noted that about the Pager study. All the resumes were exactly the same except for the name, the perceived race, and whether or not they had a criminal record. Jose didn't change anything about his resumes. He just removed the S from his first name and all of a sudden started getting called back for jobs. Another example is that President Obama's appointments, people like to say, oh, well, President Obama is an example of racial progress, right? Well, while he is symbolically, right? But when you actually look at it, literally, the lives of black and brown people have not changed a whole lot. In fact, they've actually gotten worse. since he's been president. Right now, I do think that some of the policies he's put in place are going to improve things as it relates to healthcare and other things. But as it relates to right now, people's lives are not better, right? And even President Obama, and I say symbolic because if you look at the number of judges that he's had turned down by Congress, basically almost matches the number of judges turned down by U.S. presidents in U.S. history. I mean, that's just mind blowing, right? Another part that people don't realize to this, and this is part of the institutional part, is that Bank of America and Chase, as well as Capital One, got hit with huge sanctions and fines by the Department of Justice for predatory lending against blacks and Latinos. Predatory lending means a person comes in with, say, a credit score or a certain amount of income and the amount of money to put down, and another person comes in with that same amount. And we expect that those two people are going to get the same package, the same options, the same interest rates, right? But instead, black and brown people got something that was much worse, subprime loans. White people got something else that they potentially already deserve. So see, the thing is, blacks and Latinos, again, aren't getting what they're supposed to get, right? And so due to that discrepancy, this is one of the reasons why we saw the housing bust, right? The Great Recession affect black and Latino areas more than it did white areas. In particular, Prince George's County, the most affluent black area in the country, is one of the main places where we saw predatory lending playing out, as well as in Atlanta. And so we have to really put that in context. This is happening right now. This is not in the past. But if we want to talk about the past, we actually have to talk about the historical legacy of the GI Bill. Because, see, that's one of the things Colin Kaepernick is trying to highlight. See, the GI Bill, and you can read about this in When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katz Nelson, who lays out this wonderfully about minimum wage and unions and the GI Bill, but specifically as it relates to the GI Bill. 8 out of 10 men born during the 1920s were eventually drafted to go to war, right? Regardless of race. So individuals in World War II are fighting together. Blacks and whites on the front line. And this is what military personnel are talking about, right? Military is one of the more progressive institutions. Now, we can talk about gender, and we'll talk about that. But as it relates to racial progress, we see some of that, partly because blacks are more likely actually to enlist in the military than whites. That's something people don't necessarily know. So fighting for racial discrimination or fighting against racial discrimination doesn't mean anti-American. Right? In fact, it is inherently American to fight for your human rights, right? To be able to voice your opinion, to say what you think is wrong with our country, right? So the GI Bill, when veterans return from war, the GI Bill was one of the largest, and still today, one of the largest federal initiatives handed out to citizens, right? People use GI Bill money to attend college, to put down payments on houses, start businesses, and send their children to college. Well, see, the GI Bill was mandated federally and distributed locally. So what people don't realize is that all of these black veterans return mostly to the South, but in other parts of the country too, the Midwest, the East Coast, and the West, right? People always like to put stuff on the South. This was systemic. This was national. That when they returned, they did not get allocated the GI Bill money in the same way that whites did. The GI Bill is, along with the minimum wage, is one of the main initiatives that established the middle class, or the white middle class we know to exist today. We have to think about it. These individuals were in their 30s and 40s and the 50s and 60s, right? They were having children. Their kids were going to college. Black veterans did not get those same opportunities, even though they fought for our country in the same way, right? That historical legacy of the GI Bill, that form of discrimination, still impacts us today. It impacts wealth. It impacts home ownership. It impacts business ownership. And it affects people's ability to transfer wealth and educational capital and social capital and cultural capital to the next generation, right? We have to make that connection. And then we have restrictive covenants, right? Restrictive covenants are essentially guidelines put in place by neighborhood associations for the most part, saying that they wouldn't rent, lease, or sell to black or brown people, right? And some of these restrictive covenants are still on the books. There were stories about this just last week. I mean, this stuff is not in the past, right? So what you have to do is you actually have to say it. Say it. It's racial discrimination. It's racism. Say it. Claim it. Call it that. It's racism. Admit to yourself that it exists, right? And so I just continuously be perplexed. I'm continuously perplexed by the cognitive dissonance that's happening among people that I know, right? Who evidently in their world don't necessarily see racism. Well, just because it's not happening in your world or you think it's not happening in your world doesn't mean it's not happening in the world. It doesn't mean it's not happening in our society. So see, racism exists today. We have to dispel the myth that racism is only something that's in the past, something that black people are holding on to, right? And so as we think about it, people always say, well, another narrative I've heard is that, oh, well, white people are blaming black people are blaming white people for the past. No. Black people aren't necessarily blaming white people for the past. What we are blaming you for is the current ways that racism is playing out today and your denial that structural, systemic, and institutional and historical racism still impact us today, right? So essentially what you're doing is you're ignoring the fact that there's 2 inches of a knife still stuck in our backs, right? And that 4 inches that's been pulled out a little bit is still making a wound in our back, right? That is what this is about. Right, I remember my granddaddy used to tell me that that story all the time about the knife, and I thought he made it up, and then I found out like Malcolm X said it. And I just thought my granddaddy was like one of the coolest people ever. And so finally, to my friends and classmates from high school and college who think that racism, or sexism, or classism, or homophobia go away by not talking about it, then you live a very privileged life. Right? You live a very privileged life. And your white privilege, your class privilege, your male privilege, your cis privilege may be so chronic that you actually don't even realize it. So that 2 inches worth of the knife and the wound that the 4 inches left in our back, that is what we're talking about today. And that is what is still happening today. I wish America was over racism, but we're not. And if you're on the escalator, going down the escalator, right, and you're just looking at things going along and you're not necessarily thinking that you actually need to do something about it, then you aren't helping to change the system. You are simply helping to maintain it. So this is my daily thought. Conversations matter like Black Lives and Books, and I hope that this has sparked one.